It's January 29, Ukraine Media Center starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko, and now we will be talking about Interpol and other mechanisms to prosecute war criminals. And joining us in our studio today are Vitalii Kasap, head of the International Police Cooperation Department of the National Police of Ukraine, Ms. Iryna Didenko, Deputy Head of the Department for International Legal Cooperation, Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, and Andrii Yakovlev, expert on international humanitarian law at Media Initiative for Human Rights. Good morning, dear friends. Well, the matter of Interpol is pretty interesting for Ukraine. Ukraine is part of Interpol. However, within the last 3 years of the full-scale invasion, we haven't been seeing any tools of Interpol to be working in Ukraine. For example, previously Russian Federation put one of the Ukrainians, Dmitro Yarosh, on Interpol's wanted list. He ended up there. However, when Ukraine submitted Viktor Yanukovych to be added to that list, a former president of Ukraine, he was not added though. So, Mr. Vitalii, why the tools of Interpol have such a selective nature, and we're not seeing that they're helping us in the search of war criminals? Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you, Svetlana, for your question. A right one, but probably not quite correct to its very nature. The tools of Interpol within the last 3 years really have been having certain limitations in terms of their application. However, it doesn't apply in no case to the whole, so to say, system of Interpol tools that we continue using since the very moment of beginning of the operation of the National Bureau that was established in 1993. Ukraine is an active member of Interpol Criminal Police and our National Central Bureau that continues operating on the platform of our department, to a certain extent represents and coordinates the use of Interpol tools by all of the competent authorities in Ukraine. When it comes to the use of the tools in particular during investigation of war crimes, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, definitely the General Secretariat of Interpol has taken quite an interesting stance with regard to what the applications that we've submitted to investigate certain war crimes. Well, all of those processes were put on pause by the General Secretariat of Interpol. I would like to mention that with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the General Secretariat of Interpol has taken a resolution to impose certain restrictions with regard to Russian Federation, specifically about their requests to publish certain cards for processing by General Secretariat. So basically, General Secretariat screens all of the requests coming from Moscovian Bureau to check their compliance with the principles of Interpol and rules of their operation, specifically with Article 3 that prohibits any investigations related to politics or any warlike situations. Well, you've mentioned Mr. Yanukovych. In his case, he's fallen under Article 3 of the Interpol statute, and thus back then we got rejection of our request. When it comes to Mr. Yarosh, I cannot tell you for sure, but at the same time, we respond to such facts immediately. On top of that, we sometimes work proactively in the most of cases when we see that the investigation committee of Russian Federation puts these or those Ukrainian political figures or cultural actors on the wanted list. We report to the General Secretariat of Interpol to consider this situation, and in case a relevant request would be coming, they would respond respectively. And now let's get back to the situation with processing of our requests related to war crimes. Obviously, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we've got a number of requests from our pre-court investigation authorities to publish certain war criminal personal cards within the criminal investigations that were going on back then and whose whereabouts were not identified. As per the common practice in General Secretariat of Interpol, we've reported to the Secretary General for consultations related to certain number of war criminals about the specific cases, with the request to evaluate those requests for their compliance with the Interpol statute and Article 3, which is, again, let me repeat myself, is a common practice that we usually use in cases like that. Well, it happened in the middle of the year 22. Unfortunately, almost 2 years, the Secretariat was reviewing our requests. They were involved in different experts, internal consultations in Interpol. When we had such an opportunity, we were setting up working meetings during which we were emphasizing that it's unacceptable to process the requests for such a long time. But let's remember that Interpol as an organization has the biggest number of member states, 196 countries in total. It's a very complex bureaucratic organization with their rules and established procedures, a statute that is more than 100 years old, and they have pretty common procedures with regard to what to pay attention to, but again, insisting on the result. Back in May last year, we got a response from the General Secretariat. Again, it's important to mention that Article 3 in this case puts no limitation on review of our applications by Interpol. However, the mechanism that was implemented in the year 2010, pursuant to the resolution of the General Secretariat 2010, which is aimed at reviewing instruments related to war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, cannot be used with regard to our requests due to certain concerns that the General Secretariat is viewing in a situation when the armed conflict is underway. Us, as a country who is a party to such an armed conflict, and after careful consideration, they've come to the conclusion that such a situation may produce harm on Interpol and its member states. It was important for us because when you don't have an answer, it's a matter that you cannot either dispute or discuss. But after that, we've initiated a campaign to make the General Secretariat to review their stance on this matter, and starting from June last year, during an Interpol conference in Albania, we've touched upon this issue. We've put it in front of Secretary General, Mr. Stock, back then, so that this matter is being reconsidered by all of the member states to study the legal component of that resolution, to make sure that it's eventually reviewed. There was a lot of meetings as we were working on this matter. Ukraine has been a member of European Interpol Committee starting from the year 2021. Basically, that committee was reviewing this matter. We've prepared quite a robust and reasonable analysis of the situation. We've studied the legal component, and the study was involving the foreign experts plus representatives of our Prosecutor General's office and the Ministry of Interior, to add all of the arguments that we were deeming reasonable, so that the resolution of the General Secretariat is reviewed. There was certain opposition, for what we can judge, on part of the directorship of the General Secretariat, but with the election of the new Secretary General, Mr. Urquizo, representing Brazil in November last year, we, so to say, our consultations got an additional momentum, and we hope that shortly relevant resolutions will be made by Interpol General Secretariat that would satisfy our requests eventually. Well, you've mentioned that we got this rejection in May last year because Ukraine is waging a war and it creates additional risks for Interpol. So as the war ends, are we getting more chances to have that list of Russian war criminals processed by Interpol? Well, basically in this case, what we're seeking is to have the factor of war or our ongoing participation in this war to be removed from the agenda, because from the legal perspective there is no limitation for the use of Interpol tools in any country, no matter whether it's waging a war or not. Another criteria for such restrictions is the security aspect, or the aspect of risks. For example, the situation in Syria was stimulating the Interpol General Secretariat to suspend communication with this country using Interpol channels, and the same situation is with Afghanistan. So previously there is evaluation and then there is a resolution made. So now we think that the fact of ourselves waging a war cannot create a legal ground for such a rejection. But we hope that we will be provided the opportunity to use those tools. For example, Resolution 2010 that I've already mentioned. Probably there is understanding of the tools that we can use under this resolution. This resolution contemplates 3 situations in which Interpol can process requests like this, whether they're coming from Ukraine or any other country and they are quite clear. First is the request coming from international tribunal, for example, ICC can submit a red alert notice to be published, and if the Secretariat considers the details, then they should publish such information. Then it's a request coming from a special authority established by the United Nations Security Council. Well, and now we understand that as long as Russia is sitting at the Security Council, such authority would not be established. And a third case, when this General Secretariat can process the requests from the countries with regard to war criminals, but only after they get an authorization for such processing from the country of citizenship of a suspect. So we have to understand, if even if we get an opportunity to use the mechanisms under Resolution 2010, our requests with regard to Russian war criminals to use Interpol tools will be automatically sent to Russian Federation, and they will have to provide their consent. For what we understand, they are hardly to provide their consent with regard to these matters, but at the same time we understand that we may try to use other tools not only against the citizens of Russian Federation, but other citizens of other countries who were committing war crimes in the territory of Ukraine. In no case we should look at some special treatment by the General Secretariat. The tools are equally working for all of the countries like Yugoslavia, Rwanda, everywhere where the conflicts were going on. This mechanism continues working. Moreover, if this mechanism starts working in Ukraine, Russian Federation will be using it in the same way. Obviously, we will reject any confirmations on our end, but this is the principle of equality. This is how it works when the mechanisms and the tools work for all of the countries equally, without regard to what country exactly it is. Well, thank you for the explanation, Ms. Iryna. It's not only about Interpol, but there are other organizations, international ones, that help us to bring the war criminals to liability. Can you please tell us what are other tools existing for Ukraine? Well, thank you for your question. Thank you for invitation. Well, first of all, I would like to get back to our common goal. The goal that is promoted by the prosecutors is to hold the guilty ones accountable, and Interpol is, well, yes, it's the most efficient mechanism for search of criminals, but it's a mechanism, right? It's a mechanism to find the guilty ones, those whom we're accusing as prosecutors. We've been working with the war crimes for a long time. We know about the problems of implementation this mechanism. But what is really happening? The prosecutor should have enough evidences to announce the suspicion, to indict a person, so that a person has all of the rights and can protect themselves in the courts. To achieve it, we need to see a person physically, and this is where we're coming across the problem. So first of all, we need to find a person or to convict a person in absentia. In the absence of the suspect, Ukraine is trying to ensure their rights. We're providing an attorney. Is the responsibility of the prosecutor to ensure that the attorneys are present on both phases of pre-court and court investigation. And to achieve this goal, to hold them accountable physically, what the prosecutors are doing, first of all, they're trying to publicly appeal a person who is having a status of suspect, because usually such persons are the Russians who are registered in Russia and living in Russia. So first we can do it publicly to publish, we can publish the information, the indictment notices in the website of the Prosecutors General. Russians know very well where such notices are being published, and they don't react. However, they know very well that they should. Yet another more modern option is when a prosecutor finds out about the pages of the suspects in the social networks, and we're trying to send them a message either through a messenger or a social network informing them of the criminal proceedings in their regard, then putting them on wanted list. This is the topic of our today's meetings. How can we find them during the search? So getting back to the alternative search methods, it can be bilateral cooperation between Ukraine and other countries. In fact, we have agreements with all of the countries under which we operate. That's a common practice about extradition of the criminals to Ukraine, even in case of some collisions, mismatches, absence of agreements. There is still a principle of international law, such as mutuality. If the country doesn't object, they satisfy our requests of extradition, because believe me, no civilized country would want to host a criminal in their territory who could potentially commit crimes in their land. But in order to establish such bilateral communication with the country, we have to understand that such this or that criminal is staying there. So it's a two-sided coin. First of all, the war criminals, the Russians who are being accused by Ukrainian prosecutors, they're not staying there. They're the hostages of their own country. In fact, they are serving their sentences in Russian Federation just by staying there. However, should we have an information that somebody of them is staying in the territory of other country, we have all of the rights, and we're really doing it quite quickly. We submit relevant requests asking to extradite them. We were undertaking a number of such attempts, but we were not able to confirm the information about the whereabouts of this or that criminal. Should this information be confirmed, we would have been able to get such a criminal physically. Yet another mechanism, even more important under current conditions, is the universal jurisdiction. This is what we orient all of our partners for. Why is it efficient? International crimes, war crimes, are the crimes that can be investigated by any country without regard to where the crime was committed. Every country is using that principle based on their legislation. Some of them need additional details, like, for example, the victims of the war crimes should have families in that country that have fallen victim to aggression, or probably a suspect may be staying in the territory of this or that country. And yet another principle is a super universal jurisdiction. They just decide on their own what crime can be investigated on their end, like any crime committed in any part of the world, and the countries are doing it. It's a little bit difficult for them, because the crimes are being committed in Ukraine, and in the most of the cases it's the territory that is not under Ukrainian control, so it creates additional difficulties. But should the countries take such a responsibility for investigating this that war crime. Ukraine assists them in all ways possible. We meet the delegations who investigate crimes in our territory. There was quite a famous Finnish case. I think everybody knows about it. Just recently, yet another important episode of that case was over because the Finns are about to bring an active war criminal to liability shortly, and the interrogation of witnesses is happening from the territory of Ukraine. We ensure the interrogation of evidences on a remote basis, and they provide evidences in the courts that are hearing the case in Finland, and we're approximating the resolution in this case. So in that case, a person will be brought to liability not in absentia, but he's going to get a real sentence because he is staying in Finland. That's a very convincing practice, and hopefully after the case is finalized, more countries are about to pay more attention to this. We understand that the countries have a lot of resources dedicated to it. They have their criminal system, they have to investigate their crimes, but still they're interested in investigating war crimes in Ukraine, and more they are using the principle of this universal jurisdiction. And there is the new convention, Lublin Hague Convention, that is aimed to reinforce it, and it segregates. You've mentioned the terminology. I think that my colleagues are about to provide more details about this. It's important to segregate persecution under war crimes or political crimes. So people were referring to different paragraphs in an attempt to withhold from investigation of such cases, and now this new resolution is aimed at expanding the cooperation between the countries and to remove all of the obstacles to facilitate even the procedure of handing over of evidences. So, for example, if the Netherlands investigates any crimes, so we could hand them over the evidences more quickly. For example, when it comes to the universal resolution, it's popping up on the criminal code of Ukraine, and everything is set forth quite clearly there, so we know all of the procedures, and they don't depend on the people because everything is already on paper, so to say. We have such mechanisms in place, and what I would like also to say that there is no reason behind that. Everybody is aimed at work. We had no single case of communication with other countries that would end with the word no. What they're saying, as soon as they set their foot on our land, we detain them and we bring them to liability. Well, even if a country doesn't want to extradite a war criminal, well, a person who is a war criminal in our opinion, we may still use such a principle as handing over of criminal investigation so that a war criminal is brought to liability in other countries. We use the same tool. Sometimes Ukraine is rejecting. Usually it's when a person who is a citizen of Ukraine, we take the responsibility for that criminal investigation from their countries and we inform them on the results respectively. Thank you very much, Ms. Iryna, for explanation. Mr. Vitalii, you have something to add? Yes, if I may, I would like to add to what Ms. Iryna has mentioned, talking about alternative tools with the reference to the first option that Iryna has suggested to ensure that the bilateral cooperation is used. So how can we find a criminal who is staying in the territory of another country? It's important to mention here that it's not only Interpol's responsibility. Currently, national police, along with our department, acts as a coordinator in cooperation with Europol, European Police Agency. And since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we've set up quite a fruitful cooperation with them. There is a dedicated unit in Europol who is investigating war crimes. We exchange information with them. For example, that Finnish case that was mentioned, it happened successfully after the successful exchange of information between Ukraine and Finland, and this is when Finland documented the presence of that person in their territories. So what we do next, we upload all of the information about the citizens of Russian Federation who are suspected of committing war crimes to the information systems of Europol, so that information is aware to all of the countries that are using this information system, this channel of communication. Thank you very much for your addition. Now let's get back to the topic of Interpol. Mr. Vitalii has just explained the bureaucratic processes that are creating obstacles for us in search of war criminals on international level, but what are the terminological or legal obstacles for such an efficient cooperation in this area? Thank you very much for your question. Thank you for invitation. Let me give you an example how important it is and the position of Interpol secretary. I'm not a government official. I am less restricted. Well, look, for example, in the city there are two belligerent streets and a crime is committed, a lot of people get killed, an investigator finds a suspect and they're asking police to find them and to detain them. But the police is saying, sorry, we cannot take care of this crime because we're seeing there is a complex situation. It's like it's even dangerous, like that street may accuse your street. Well, we have 1,000 years of history. We do a lot of useful things. Well, that's true, really. But we're not going to sort out this situation for you because you're the belligerent party, so we're not here to help you in cases like that. And basically, when it comes to the war crimes, everybody keeps saying that the international law is not efficient. Why? Because the international humanitarian law is about the laws and customs of war, but to investigate the violation of such laws and customs, to hold someone accountable, there should be someone who can enforce it all around the world, and such organizations just don't exist. So basically we can initiate a case, we may look through our territory, we may ask all of the countries of the world, or maybe those can be the courts of universal jurisdiction. Even the ICC, they may only search in 125 countries, but there is no universal authority that could search in all of the countries. The only such organization is Interpol, but it was not established for such purposes. And now we want to tell them, like, look, now you have to do this thing too, because there's no one to replace you. Like, all those mechanisms are complex. And on top of that, we may say, like, imagine the war crimes are the crimes against the global order, crimes against everybody, and every country considering themselves a part of this global order may consider themselves victims of such crimes. So this is basically the grounds of universal jurisdiction. If everybody thinks so, still there is no authority who could enforce the investigation. That's why the Interpol's function is the most important here. Now, why is Interpol rejecting? Well, it was already mentioned, Article 3, that says that the matters of religious, political, or religious nature, and it says military there. Military doesn't mean war crimes. So it means crimes against the order of military service, but not crimes against the customs and laws of war. So, but it says of military nature that can be construed in a number of ways. In my opinion, I would like to corroborate what my colleague has said, that the war crimes still can be investigated. This resolution 2010 was already mentioned, and there were more resolutions afterwards. And those resolutions, they were saying that Interpol may ensure the investigation of war crimes like crime of aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity. So if they can't do it, and no one has amended Article 3, thus it's officially recognized that Article 3 imposes no restrictions. So it doesn't matter who was requesting Interpol, whether it's the country of Ukraine or is it ICC, if this resolution contemplates the broad construing of Article 3, it means that it's like a responsibility of organization who doesn't want to undertake additional responsibilities. But in a position when there is no one else who could do it, I mean to do it in an efficient way, so probably we should somehow stimulate, somehow push the heads of Interpol so they proceed to doing it well. Definitely there are risks if they start this mechanism. Our citizens accused by Russian Federation can be persecuted too, just like we accuse their citizens. But if it's about a war crime, it doesn't contemplate a statute of limitation. It's a crime against a global order. So by large account, we have 150,000 documented cases, and we're the party which is the mostly affected by failure to use this tool. So I'm on the side of broad construing of this resolution, and it's about the press who should advocate this matter before the Central Bureau of Interpol, who is supposed to change their approaches to enable bringing the criminals to liability, because this Lublin Convention is saying that an attempt to re-evaluate the case, to make it the case of everybody, to stop the war crimes and to bring the guilty ones to liability, like the key task of the criminal justice is to influence a person, to influence them with the hardness of punishment, because the potential criminals, they potentially think like how severe may a punishment be, and what happens if I'm getting caught. Well, if they think like, no, I'm never getting caught, I'm not even going to be searched for in Turkey, Emirates, or Kazakhstan. I don't care what happens here. I'm going to commit those war crimes. So when we talk about the war crimes, we're talking about the prevention effect. So I would like to support the position of Europol and international contacts. Europol is really an efficient organization because they have no restrictions, whether it's military or war crimes. I had a case myself when we were disputing a Europol order about the arrest in Greece. So it's an efficient structure, it's an efficient organization, but we have not yet joined the European Union, but still our companies are being assisted there. Our citizens have the rights equal to the rights of the citizens of European Union. So it's logical to enter into relevant agreements with Europol, so it's not only a cooperation, but so that they start dealing with our cases directly. Thank you very much, Mr. Andrii. Dear colleagues, do we have any questions on the floor? If so, please raise your hands and grab the microphone. Vasil Tudov, Media Initiative for Human Rights. I'm having a question to the representative of Prosecutor General's office. A representative of Interpol has told us quite an interesting story about the impossibility of the use of the tools. But when there is a criminal investigation, a court proceeding, and the court is asking whether the participants were applying to Interpol, they're responding that yes, they cannot, they were rejected because during the pre-court investigation, the court has not taken a relevant resolution to add a Russian citizen to their information system as a war criminal. So I'm having this question to prosecutor's office. So have you reacted to such a rejection by Interpol? I don't think that I'm quite following you. Okay, just give us an example. Well, I can give you the names of the Russians. Look, so there was a case considered by Ivankiv court. 2 criminals, Belik Bazajapov and Volodymyr Nikonomov. So the law enforcement requested Interpol, and Interpol told them, we cannot add them to the Interpol database because during the pre-court investigation the court has not recognized their guilt as war criminals. Well, I think that Mr. Vitalii should be better aware with the situation. So it looks like you're lying. Well, I'm not aware of this specific situation, but there are relevant procedures. Well, such things are not on the instruction. What instruction well, there is an instruction dating back to the year 2020 that was approved by the joint order of the law enforcement agencies. Well, there is a procedure that sets forth the procedure for use of the Interpol tools depending on the request that you want to make to Interpol. And there is the package of documents. For example, there is a mandatory approval. No, there is no court approval. Well, you're talking about investigation and search. Yes, search during the pre-court investigation, not the court investigation, but pre-court investigation. And if there is an approval, if there is a resolution made by the prosecutor, maybe it was not about the search but the detention. Maybe it was about the detention, right? Well, there was already a resolution about the detention, and your organization was requesting another resolution to be approved by the court. Well, let me generalize, if I may. Well, look, there is a list of documents that Interpol needs for efficient fulfillment of search mechanism. It's a mechanism, it's not a resolution. When it comes to court and pre-court investigations, it doesn't influence those processes. Just to withdraw from your example, because I think it's a little bit of a misunderstanding here. We're just going to entangle ourselves in those world constructions. So for what we understand, you're asking whether we can make some remarks to those who are involved with cooperation with Interpol. What I was meaning that Interpol illegally rejected us to put them on the wanted list. So your question is whether we have any mechanism of influence over them. Well, you do. Well, we don't have any such mechanisms. Well, the principle of international cooperation, and Interpol is a part of international cooperation, is based on like any voluntary intentions. I cannot. Yeah, just please don't interrupt the speaker. You were asking the question. Well, the enforcement doesn't work here. It's about the voluntary nature of it. That's the basis of international cooperation. And don't vest any additional responsibilities in Interpol. Every participant country, every member state takes their efforts for search of the criminals, and this is what all of the Interpol activity boils down to. Well, let me add, I think that it was a specific case. There were 2. Well, but the problem is not that somebody is rejecting on the national level. We know that they cannot do it in reality. The problem is, like, if it would be a problem of executioner, then it would be a problem. But the problem is that they don't have efficient tools to produce a result on a central level according to relevant procedure on the official level, they're taking a stance that probably we were submitting a request under this resolution. This request should be communicated to the country whose citizens are being searched for. Within a month, that country may either reject to proceed to the search and orienting at this example, or probably they have never been doing it, thinking that Russian Federation would refuse immediately. So this system just needs to work. This is what we need to make sure that this resolution gets a momentum. This is what's really important, because if it's only about the resolution of the court, I think our investigators would help there. So Mr. Vitalii wants to add something, and then we'll pass the microphone. Well, I think that there is a specific case that we can discuss. Let's discuss it afterwards, but let's not forget that us as the National Bureau of Interpol of Ukraine, we ensure relevant cooperation, and such cooperation is in place. If you check all of the red cards submitted by us, we are on 13th place all around the world, and when it comes to yellow cards, we're in the first place. We know the procedure, we set it forth properly in national legislation, and we appeal to Interpol, and we seek the processing of our requests by them. So let's talk after this event in detail. Dear colleagues, do we have any more questions on the floor? Valentina Samarka, the Rome Center of Journalist Investigations. I have a general question. Can you please give us a general picture? Mr. Kasap has mentioned what was the number of yellow and red cars, but the problem have been here starting from the year 2014. Just for the general picture, how many requests the National Bureau has submitted? Are there any successful cases? How many rejections have we gotten? If there are successful cases, can you please describe them in terms of bilateral cooperation between National Bureau and other national bureaus of other countries? So not through the Central Bureau, but through the bilateral mechanism. And I have more questions. Well, let's go one by one so our speakers don't forget what they are asked about. Well, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we got about 70 requests from the pre-court investigation agencies to publish the red alerts, red cards with regard to war criminals. Well, as I've already reported, the General Secretariat doesn't consider even an opportunity to review such cases, but still, as I've already mentioned, we're trying to change their stance. Whether the picture will change, I don't think that fundamentally, because there are rules, there are procedures, and we cannot just step over those rules and procedures. And your next question, well, was about bilateral, and I was hoping all of the speakers may respond. Well, let me reiterate it. We want the mechanism to come into effect. As soon as it comes into effect, the prosecutors will be ready to forward. Well, there are 764 requests for red cards with regard to the suspects that were identified as those suspected of committing war crimes. Well, if the mechanism is unblocked, tomorrow we will be ready to submit our request, or in case there is other mechanism established, we may use it immediately. Is Ukraine perseverant enough? Are you taking sufficient efforts? Well, basically this problem has not been moving for years and years. But if we go to the website of Interpol, they have all of the information about international crimes, crimes of genocide. Just believe me, we take all possible and impossible efforts to force the directorship of the General Secretariat of Interpol to change their stance in this regard. Again, it's an international organization. We are unfortunately just one out of 196 countries. They always reiterate on the principle of their objectivity and neutrality, and whether we want it or not, we have to work with them under the existing rules. I can just compare it with the, say, United Nations. Obviously, we take all of the possible and impossible efforts to take a stance there, but within the set rules. Hopefully, again, their position of the directorship will change, and our next step is to change the position of Secretary General on this matter. In parallel, we have another process running to add to the rule of Interpol the procedure for exclusion of a country from Interpol. This matter has been considered for a number of years. The sanctions are still imposed on the aggressor. We keep doing everything that we can. Just believe me. Do we have any more questions? Igor Levenok, Inter TV channel. I'm having a question to Mr. Vitalii and Ms. Iryna. Can you please tell us whether the resolutions of the Ukrainian courts may serve as ground for investigation by Interpol? If not, then why do we even need courts like that on a national level? Well, I would like to draw your attention to this fact that Interpol doesn't evaluate the sufficiency of evidences, or when it comes to court resolutions, whether it's one court or another court, they look at it with the cold head. Their task is to prevent the violation of human rights, because when a country persecutes somebody, it's a violation of this right, again, because the countries want to detain a person. But again, I didn't want to recall it, but I think I have to. Russia is abusing those mechanisms of international law. They're trying, and sometimes they're successfully doing it with regard to criminal cases, and Interpol cannot check whether a person is accused of, say, robbery legally or illegally, and they try to balance this system to prevent any violations of human rights. That's why this mechanism works equally for pre-court investigation, because me as a prosecutor, I'm given a guarantee that I'm going to accuse, or is it a court who has already taken a resolution to bring an accused person to liability, or whether it's a Ministry of Justice who interferes during the court hearing. So I think it's not going to influence the process in one way or another. Thank you. There were more questions on that end. Astasia Moskvichova, Grati. I'm having a question to Mr. Vitalii or Ms. Iryna. You were saying that should Interpol start searching for Russian war criminals, Russia will be able to submit requests about the Ukrainians under fabricated cases in case of Europol. Isn't it happening? If so, so what's the difference? And another third question, on top of the case of Jan Petrovsky in Finland, were there other successful cases when Russian war criminals were searched and found by Interpol? Well, Europol is not Interpol. Interpol is unique, just like Europol is. Interpol is unique with its systems, databases, publications, cards. There are more tools, there are other databases, but the most well-known is the publications. Europol is a European law enforcement agency of European Union, which is assisting in investigation of serious crimes, organized crime, and terrorism, including war crimes. Their tools are analytical projects in this or that area of criminal activities. So they gather information, they store it, they process it, they produce analytical products that they're sharing with other countries that request them to do so. There is no search system in Europol or any similar system. There is a system of communication between the member states that was established by Europol, Siena communication system, thanks to which a prompt communication between the law enforcement officers is going on, and at the same time a project to investigate war crimes is involved to the maximum extent. For example, in cases of our investigations, we ask our colleagues from Europol to check certain information about the suspects or to identify the witnesses of this or that crime. They gather information of different types. They gather geolocation, video, audio, photographic documents that they're not only getting from law enforcement agencies with whom they cooperate, but also from non-government organizations involved in OSINT, for example. All of that stuff is accumulated and then added as an element that is laid as a foundation to our criminal proceedings. They are a real powerful partner. They've established OSINT operational task force. Recently, they've involved OSINT experts from 14 different countries, and they work with our requests at their homes. You know, currently everything is going on in internet, and this is exactly what they're dealing with, thanks to the technologies, thanks to their capabilities, and including analytical capabilities. They help us in those cases. Well, there were questions about successful cases. On top of that finished one, there were successful cases of identification or matches, as they call it. For example, there are witnesses who are staying abroad and they report their evidences to the local law enforcement authorities, who share that information with Europol. We submit the request about this or that war crime committed, and thus we have a witness of this or that war crime. And such examples are numerous. There is no, for example, identification of location as in case of Finland, but Finland was the case that was the fundamental. Well, can you mention the European arrest warrant? It exists in European countries, and under it, the criminals get arrested. Well, I think I should give the floor to Iryna, but European arrest order is a tool that is not used extensively by Europol. It's used by the countries. No, I just wanted you to mention it as one of the mechanisms. Well, unfortunately, our time is running out, so please be brief. Well, we're aspiring to become a part of European Union, and as soon as we become it, it's a real efficient tool, the use of this arrest warrant. But so far, we're on our path of Euro integration, and we're trying to amend our legislation to make sure that our regulations are close to the European ones, so we can use that resolution. And as long as it's going on, our procedure with the extradition request, but again, it's the procedural resolution. It's a resolution whether to extradite or not. It's a general procedure that is common for all of us. We have another minute for a real short question. A question to the representative of Interpol. Have you been getting green and blue cards to be put for search? No, we didn't have any blue or green ones. And why? The question is why? Well, just because we didn't have them. Well, Prosecutor's office has nothing to do with it, because the aim of green and blue cards is a little bit different. We review the requests under the red cards with regard to those who are suspected of committing war crimes, to identify their whereabouts for further detention and extradition. Blue and green cards, they have a little bit different subject, you know. Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank all of our panelists. Hopefully the Interpol tools are gonna start working for Ukraine just shortly. So today we were discussing Interpol and other tools to prosecute war criminals, and Ukraine Media Center will continue in just half an hour, and we'll talk about the abnormally warm weather. Should we expect any frost to be coming soon? Thank you for staying tuned.